panel discussion here. We've had a few polling station results coming. So as you'd realize, we haven't had any constituency yet announced. The results we're having so far happening to be coming from the polling stations. It's the polling stations by themselves, unless you know what the polling station is like and the way the polling station has voted over the period, it's difficult for you to do any analysis with that at all. But fortunately, we have some people who have some knowledge when it comes to the polling stations. They know the polling stations and they know how the polling station, or they know some of the polling stations and how they voted in the past. And so we'll be going with our panel pretty shortly. So if we could have everybody else seated, and then we can continue with the rest of the program. So straight away, I'm going to introduce my panelists, those who are going to be helping us with the analysis this time around. So this is the second half of the program this evening, the IEA Election Watch Night. And you're all welcome back from dinner. I'd like to welcome you once again back from dinner. So straight away, we're going with our panel discussion. We're going to have this panel here with us. Pretty shortly, I'm going to be introducing them. And then as and when we have some of the results coming, we're going to announce the results to you. I'm starting from my immediate left, and Atik Mohammed is the policy analyst with the PNC. So he's representing the PNC here. And then we have Dr. William Mahaji of the National Identification Authority. And then we have another doctor, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, of the Chasing the Elephant into the Bush fame. So Dr. Arthur Kennedy wrote this very interesting book. It made quite a lot of waves. I'd just like him at this point to ask him, what would you say if you had a book titled Chasing the Elephant into the Bush after the 2008 elections? What would you say about the party now? Or what would you say if you wrote a book now? I
would say read Chasing the Elephant. Actually, I've written another one, The Drug Invasion of West Africa.
The what?
The Drug Invasion of West Africa.
Oh, it doesn't have to do with politics. I want to know what you have to do with politics today. Would it be returning the elephant from the bush?
I hope so.
Okay, so, and Dr. William Haji, before we went into this election, there was all this debate about the fact that we should have one common ID card, so then we don't have the Electoral Commission coming up with its own ID cards, the NIA coming up with its own ID cards. How far did we get with that debate?
Well, thank you. That's the one question I didn't think I was going to answer, but it comes up every time, everywhere I appear. But I think essentially that's what the intention was, to complete a national database on which all eligible Ghanaians are registered, and therefore they would have one single ID card that biometric, so means that you can't exist in the database twice, and that would be credible enough for many of the identity management services that we require for electoral purposes, for access to social services, even for detection of crime. So the trend is going towards at least the national ID, and then all the other ones can actually draw on the data that we have in the national database. That particular objective has not been abandoned, and we're working towards that as well. We're just caught by the fact that elections, which are high-stake events, caught up with us, and there was a need to ensure that at least the people were registered, and electoral roll that would not be subject to contestation was produced for the election for this year. But my anticipation is that in the subsequent years, we are going to have a system where we have one particular ID that would virtually replace this whole ritual of registering people every year. Technology is available for that. and we'll take advantage of that.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. William Ahaji. And before I come to Atik Mohammed of the PNC, I'd just like to remind you that if anyone coughs here, it's possible that the cough will be named after you. So you may want to avoid that. Or who knows? You could just have one named after you. Atik Mohammed, how have you seen the performance of the PNC? Essentially, the smaller parties are being completely ruled out of this election. I mean, there are lots of places where you're coming up with zero.
Yes, I think that is unfortunate. And this is not restricted to only the PNC. It's like you said, the universal performance by all third parties. I was expecting that, if for nothing at all, they should be able to put up a very good performance, as to be able to push the elections at best into a second round. But from the results that are coming out so far, it's so unfortunate. You have situations, and I was particularly amazed that in areas where you can consider to be the strongholds of the PNC, you have a candidate recording zero. For me, it was not only shocking, but very, worrying. To the extent that a place where he hails from, Zebila is very close to where the flag bearer is coming from, for him to have recorded zero, when GCPP, which virtually, for want of a better expression, hasn't done any much of campaign, is getting 2 and you are getting 0. But well, I think it's a reflection of so many concerns that people had raised even before the elections. And I'm sure that is coming to play, the very concerns that were raised. If they were really dealt with, and the flag bearer, and I'm sure with some other third-party flag bearers, if they had applied themselves to the concerns that were raised and really sought to address them, I'm sure they could have done better, and I'm sure Ayarga could have done better. And I'm sure I wouldn't be here saying that we've been ruled out of the game before it could even start.
Okay. And Dr. Arthur Kennedy, have you seen any of the results have you heard any of the results that have come in so far that excites you?
Well, it sounds like the ones that Kojo and his crew discussed in places like Upper West, Nanado appears to be doing quite well. When you are doing this election result analysis, you look at projections. For example, if you've been beaten 300 to 100 in Upper West, Upper East, compared to historical trends, it means you are doing well. Strategically, you look at how well you've done over the years. For example, Volta region, you're normally getting 11, 12%. If it's coming in, you are getting 18, 19%. Yeah, you are still losing, but that is very encouraging.
How about you, Dr. William Ahaji?
Yeah, I think basically what you do in the stronghold of your co-contestants is to increase your share of votes in those strongholds. And if the trend points to you getting additional numbers compared to the previous elections, then you should be giving yourself a pat in the back, because the pattern has been that the gap would be that huge, and if you can increase your share of votes in the strongholds of your political opponents, then you have to be sure that you'll probably make a very strong showing in the elections.
Okay, we'll be coming to the analysis of some of the results as and when they come in, but I'd like us to look at the voting that was done today and some of the challenges that have come up. There was a question that was posed whether this election has been free and fair. You are the parties who are involved in the thick of things. What do you think? I'll start with you, Atik.
Well, the question of fairness, I'm sure we'll be able to make any conclusion on whether indeed the entire exercise has been free and fair after we've done all that we're supposed to do. But I think that we need to raise these concerns, which I'm sure you've talked about quite severally. The issue of the materials arriving late. And it is, for me, I think this is a function of the posturing that was adopted by the Electoral Commission, that they were more or less, they had formed some kind of wall against extra suggestions coming from other people. They gave us the impression that all was well and that they really knew what they were doing and that they were fully prepared for the exercise. But when you get to a situation, Ghana is still a fledgling democracy. We are still growing. And I'm sure that at any rate, it's important to want to invite new ideas and new suggestions. But to say that you have arrived and that you may not consider other opinions...
Did they exactly say they have arrived? I'm not sure they said
those are my words, but it expresses the situation. to the extent that you bring a suggestion and Electoral Commission would not be very enthusiastic about accepting it. That is because before we even started the voting today, we had assurance from the Commission that they had sent out all materials and that the materials would get to the places, well ahead of time before the exercise. But as late as 12 o'clock today, some police stations were yet to receive their materials. And for me, I think I don't want to say it's a function of complacency, but Electoral Commission could have done better. Another thing has to do with the machines breaking down every now and again. We all anticipated from the pilot project they ran, they realized that these are machines that cannot run a whole day without breaking down, at least not all of them. So you should have had contingency mechanisms in place, such that you would provide every polling station with at least an extra machine so that in the event the breakdown does happen, they are able to quickly replace it. But you don't wait until it breaks down, then they would have to call you. It takes some time. Sometimes I was listening to a particular presiding officer expressing or lamenting his situation, saying that he tries calling his superiors and nobody was, sometimes the number is busy, sometimes it's switched off, and people in the queue were getting increasingly agitated. I think it's something we could have prevented if Electoral Commission adopted this. Okay,
I'm sure you have a few other points, but I'll come to you, Dr. Haji. You have worked with, you're familiar, or your institution is familiar with these biometric verification machines. Would you say, or how would you rate the way the EC has handled these biometric failures in quotes?
Yeah, ordinarily you shouldn't do verification on the day of election just so you can avoid the technology glitches that we have. One, because what we call the offline verification devices or the verification machines can encounter problems about information overload or processing speed on the day of the election. There are issues about, as we were told, issues about power supply to the particular device that you use, and indeed where you operate in a densely populated area, the volume of information that it has to process on the day becomes very difficult. And given the experiences that we have had in doing the biometric registration, we went through some of these challenges. So I think given the lessons that we have picked from this, we would suggest strongly that in future, we don't do the verification on the day, because if we went around and we had that many, in some of the places, as many as 2,000 people were unable to vote because the machines froze. It's just like you're using a computer and then it freezes in the middle of your work. You have to wait for it to defreeze virtually. And that probably is one of the challenges that you face when you try technology on the day of the election. But having said that, it doesn't look like it's that widespread. And maybe we are talking about 5 to 10% of the equipment failing because they are largely new. But I would suggest strongly that we re-examine this arrangement of doing the verification on the day. What it's imposing on us is that we would have to still do some voting tomorrow, and that's additional cost, and it's avoidable cost.
Okay, and at this point, I'd just like you to know if you have any questions at all that you'd like to contribute at some point in time. Yes, you can get to do that. I'll go just from Dr. Haji and to Dr. Arthur Kennedy, and then I'll come and take your question, Professor Dudu. Dr. Haji, apart from the issues that Atik Mohammed has raised, asking some of the observations they have made, are there any other observations that you have made that you think will impact on the election?
Yeah, you asked the question about whether we consider this to be a free and fair election. I mean, normally the lead up, the run up to the election would determine whether the ground is level for all the political parties, and you measure that by the rhetoric, the political speeches that they make, and the complaints that come from the political parties. We didn't get a sense that many of the political parties felt shortchanged in the run-up to the election. So yes, we can say to some extent there's some openness in the process. But I think sometimes cheating in election processes can happen before or during the elections, and some are subtle, some are very open. Again, open in the sense that people would want to, for instance, seize ballot boxes or put in thumb-printed ballot papers in boxes before or during or after the vote. But you don't get a sense that that's happening now. So I think we can give the country some credit for ensuring that at least some level of transparency and some fairness is happening. If people didn't feel fair, you can be sure that by now there have been areas of violent, conflicts already.
Okay, and talking about freeness and fairness in the run-up to the polls, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, I've heard some members of the New Patriotic, oh well, it was the PPP flag bearer who had an issue with the fact that the president addressed the nation on the very last day, or yesterday, just a day before the polls, when everybody else was supposed to be not campaigning. The president wasn't exactly campaigning, but he felt that the PPP flag bearer, Dr. Pakwesi Ndum, felt that the fact that we had the president having the last say was unfair to the rest of the parties. Do you share that view?
Well, I think that fundamentally we are overselling our democracy. You know, we talk about how good we are, how the rest of Africa and the world is admiring, but 4 years ago, we went to the brink of a war. You know, people massing at the EC. It seems like we have very short memories. As soon as these things pass over, we kind of pat ourselves on the back and we tell everybody how good we are.
But Dr. Kennedy,
I'm coming, please. If you let me finish. You know, this cycle, for example, I think that the level of mistrust in the system has reached a very high level. I'm not saying that it is necessarily reasonable mistrust, but there is a lot of mistrust because people don't trust significant actors to act fairly. For example, when you look at our security forces and how they deal with election violence or intemperate language, it seems very uneven, and that does not engender confidence, particularly on the side of the opposition. And to be fair, when the MPP was in power, there was that same sense on the part of the NDC that were in opposition, that our security forces were maybe not as even-handed as they would have been. You know, a lot of MPP people would tell you about by-election violence that went unchecked. People would tell you about intemperate language on the side of some people that were ignored, while other people were held before the law. Even when it comes to NGOs, it seems as if our approach to these things are not very even-handed. You know, you see condemnations of people who say the same thing, then when similar things are said by people on the other side. So these things fuel mistrust. So the failures of today are not as much to do with the Electoral Commission's operations. Yeah, they made mistakes. For example, they could have foreseen that maybe these machines will freeze, maybe some places wouldn't vote, so they shouldn't have needed crunch meetings today, for example, to determine that if this happened, we'll do that, if that happened. But part of the problem is the general sense of mistrust. And I can tell you, last night, there were a lot of rumors around about people coming from elsewhere to vote, and they are sewing police uniforms, and people have ballots somewhere, and all those things find fertile ground because our system has a lot of mistrust, and we need to work to reduce the mistrust.
Okay. Professor Alex Dodo, we can take your question now. Okay, otherwise, okay, I'll get a mic, I'll get them to get a mic to you, but we'll continue. Are there any other observations, Dr. Arthur Kennedy, that you made that you think will impact on this election?
Oh, I actually think, and it seemed like you were going there, Kojo Opon and his panel were going there about whether, for example, some people voting today and having the results announced would impact those who vote tomorrow. I think so. You know, I don't necessarily know what the solution is, but if, for example, by the time people are queuing to vote tomorrow, they know that all of Central Region voted and they went this way, and we know that significant portions of Greater Accra, other places have not voted, it is very difficult to argue that that will not affect how they vote. It doesn't mean I know the cure, but I think that should be of some concern to us.
But these are polling stations, I must add. So these are polling stations where we're looking at probably maybe 1,000 max votes.
Well, that's not what I heard, though. I thought that there were places where people were talking about almost up to 10%, 5 to 10%. That's quoted. I've heard similar figures. But my point is that let's assume for the sake of argument that all of Central Region was able to finish voting, and significant parts of, say, Greater Accra and Brahafo were not able to finish voting. And tomorrow, by the time some of them are in the queue, they are hearing, for example, that, the MPP won Central Region. I'm saying that it might have some effect, the same way that the panel argued that, for example, knowing the results of the first round voting had an impact in the second round when people knew, for example, that these people have won X number of seats or Y number of seats.
Okay. And Atik, would it be a worry to the PNC, this issue about the fact that knowing where some other regions or some other polling stations have voted, if it happens that they're having to vote tomorrow in areas where probably the MPNC could have done better, do you think that you're going to be losing everything?
I don't think it's necessarily about the PNC. I'm just going to speak generally about the effect this can have. And I share greatly what Doc has expressed. And in addition to the fact that it could impact on how people are going to vote tomorrow, it also has this tendency of, there's this thing about people voting. There's this trend. Sometimes this groupthink is something that has a great deal of effect when it comes to voting. To the extent that, for instance, and it happens especially during second rounds, when some regions realize that in the first round, this particular political party was doing well, and it stands a good chance of winning, it is always almost easier for them to decide that, well, why don't we give the opportunity to this party? And I'm sure similar scenario is likely to play out tomorrow. And in addition to that is the safety of the ballots that already have been cast. How sure are we that these votes or these ballots are going to be very well protected before tomorrow? They are saying that the various agents should put their seals on the boxes. I don't think that is enough a guarantee that something will not happen to those boxes. And for the most part, the complaints of political parties and their agents have always been that when things like these happen, there is always some room for manipulation. Is it going to be kept in the offices of the Electoral Commission, at the police station? Where are these boxes going to be kept? We've had situations where ballot boxes were kept even in police stations. Something was done to those boxes. At the end of the day, when the policemen were asked, they said, oh, we're here, you brought them and kept them there. What did you expect us to do? So I'm very worried about the safety of those boxes, in addition to the fact that it has an effect, or it could have an effect on the eventual outcome of the voting. But I personally think that this is something we could have done. Once we have invited this mess in course for ourselves, we could have just gone ahead with it and then deal with it. Allow people to be in the queue, let them vote, even if they had to stay in the queue for 3 more hours and so that we'll be able to deal with this, have it over and done with. Now we are all concerned about our inability to announce specifically which constituency is voting for which party and so on. It's all because we are having a difficulty completing the process, which in my opinion is something we could have completed if indeed the Electoral Commission were committed to it.
Okay, Professor Alex, do you have your question now?
Actually, thanks, Israel. My question has to do with, I think it's to all 3 panelists. It's basically about the fact that the moment we change the rules by which we agreed on elections, we cannot trust the outcomes. Nobody could trust. I mean, we can use all the big words. The moment people have come and queued, the moment people have put their trust in an election which in 2008 was so close, 0.5% or less, and the Electoral Commission could not get it right. Why? The question is why? Here we sit in the very lovely plush garden, speaking all the big words, and just we cannot get machines to work because either there was no petrol, if the reports are clear, or no battery. This is not acceptable. It's about time we stop the big words and the BS. The bottom line is that either somebody is willfully negligent or doesn't get it. And this is about time we change these sort of things. You cannot go to a close election with any error, especially when the margin of the error is so small that it can tilt either way. This is what causes problems. And if the parties are going to sit down and give us big words and say, it doesn't matter, I'm sorry. If it's healthcare, where I work, you're going to say, are you going to accept that 1% you die? So it's all right? No. So for me, the failure of the EC, however minimal, is not acceptable. Ghanaians are too used to give it to God. It is unacceptable. You either do the job or you get fired. If you can't do the job, just bugger off and get somebody else. Till we learn to speak the truth directly and truthfully. Till we learn to hold people to 100% accountability. We're just wasting our time. Tonight is Friday night. We could be clubbing. And if we are here because we want to choose